Hello and welcome to another episode of A Brief History. Today's episode, Castlevania. Ready, set, go.
May 1st, 1987. Having built itself on a library of colorful and cartoony games like Duck Hunt and Super Mario Bros., the Nintendo Entertainment System had successfully pulled the entire gaming industry out of the gutter. But at the time, of all the things that the NES had, one thing it had very little of was horror, a game genre that seems virtually inescapable today. But all of this changed with the release of the now classic Castlevania, an NES action platformer themed entirely around horror. Now in Japan, the game was released in 1986 for the Famicom Disk System, along with an expanded exploration-based remake for the MSX2 called Vampire Killer. Vampire Killer was never released in North America, but was the first Castlevania game released in Europe. However, it is the NES version, released in North America on May 1st, 1987, that is considered the true premiere of the Castlevania franchise.
Developed by Konami, Castlevania took its inspiration loosely from the classic Universal monster movies of old, as well as the famous story of Bram Stoker's Dracula. In this game, you assume the role of vampire hunter Simon Belmont, who must storm Dracula's castle and end the Count's reign of terror once and for all. Sort of. You do this by traversing stage after stage, killing enemies with a whip and multiple items, eating meat, and taking down other classic horror monsters like Medusa, Frankenstein's monster, and a bat. Ooh. So platforming, killing enemies, and boss battles seems pretty standard for an NES game, right? Well, yeah, I guess it kinda was, but what made Castlevania stand out was its aforementioned horror theme.
Castlevania based almost every aspect of its design around making the player uneasy. Environments were gothic and ominous, enemy placement was treacherous, and the enemies themselves were relentless. And this already insane difficulty was only made more intense by Castlevania's bizarre control scheme. Simon Belmont moved at the top speed of a brisk power walk, his jump was stilted and impossible to control midair, while whipping enemies was noticeably delayed, and getting hit by anything knocked him back like 2 feet. All of this combined made Castlevania a brutally difficult and enjoyable, unsettling experience unlike any other NES game at the time. And the game was a great success, gaining very positive reception and a notorious reputation for its difficulty.
So the doors were wide open for a Castlevania sequel, and Konami were not about to pass up this opportunity. Not long after the release of Castlevania, a follow-up began development and was released on December 1st, 1988, under the name Castlevania II: Simon's Quest. But keep in mind that this was the era of sequels like Super Mario Bros. 2 and Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, games that showed that their developers weren't quite sure how to follow up on their massive hit games. And unfortunately, this was also kind of the case with Simon's Quest.
While it more or less maintained the same style and feel of the original Castlevania, Simon's Quest made some massive changes to the formula, introducing many RPG elements, such as towns full of NPCs, upgrades that level up your character in different ways, lots and lots of grinding, and a day and night mechanic that would change up the strength of enemies and close down all shops and churches in the towns, forcing the player to survive the night before allowing them to progress in the game. That is a long sentence. From the beginning, that was one sentence. You're insane! This was a massive departure from what was established in the original Castlevania, and while the game was still received positively back in the late 1980s, Simon's Quest has since become infamous among the gaming community for many reasons, some a little more obvious than others.
But anyway, following Simon's Quest, Konami returned to the formula of the original Castlevania for the next 2 games in the series. The first was 1989's Castlevania The Adventure for the Nintendo Game Boy, the first handheld game in the series that soon gave way to its own little side series of Game Boy titles and even saw an enhanced WiiWare remake years later, subtitled Rebirth. The second game was Castlevania III: Dracula's Curse, released on September 1st, 1990 for the NES. The final game in the franchise to be released for the original Nintendo, Castlevania III expanded upon the design of the first game by introducing branching pathways and multiple playable characters. A refined formula that earned Castlevania III very positive reviews all around.
And the story was very much the same for the next game in the series, Super Castlevania 4, released for the Super Nintendo on December 4th, 1991. Considered an enhanced reimagining of the first Castlevania, Super Castlevania 4 stood out from its predecessors thanks to all new level designs, highly detailed environments, and the tightest controls ever seen in a Castlevania game at that point. For the first time ever, in this game, the player could whip in 8 different directions, use the whip as a grappling hook, and even flail their whip like some idiot swatting at a bee. In addition to more accessible whip controls, Simon Belmont's jumps were far easier to control, allowing for some mid-air movement.
But all the pretty scenery and tight controls didn't keep Super Castlevania 4 from being yet another insanely challenging entry to the series that once again earned incredibly high review scores from critics across the board, even going so far as to be considered the quintessential classic Castlevania game. But this is where things in the Castlevania world start to get weird, or well, weirder. Following the success of Super Castlevania 4, in March of 1994, the world was greeted with Castlevania Bloodlines, a slightly more traditional Castlevania game that ditched the smoother controls of its predecessor in favor of the far more limited control scheme scheme of the NES game, at least for the most part. Now, unlike every game in the series before it, Bloodlines was the first Castlevania not released for a Nintendo console. Rather, this was the first and only game in the franchise released as a Sega Genesis exclusive, and much like its predecessors, Bloodlines was received extremely well.
But where Bloodlines was chronologically the follow-up to Super Castlevania 4 in North America and Europe, in Japan there was another title that was released in between those two games. In Japan, the next entry in the series after Super Castlevania 4 was known as Castlevania Rondo of Blood, and it was released on October 29, 1993 for the PC Engine CD, known in America as the TurboGrafx CD. Unfortunately, this game wouldn't see a real North American release until 14 years later in the 2007 PSP game Castlevania The Dracula X Chronicles, and then later, in 2010, being ported to the Nintendo Wii's Virtual Console. But back in the 90s, what was released outside of Japan was known as Castlevania Dracula X, a 1995 Super Nintendo game which had a similar story to Rondo of Blood and even used some of its assets. Once again, retaining the design and controls of the NES original, Castlevania Dracula X earned a pretty mixed response upon release, with critics claiming that the game was too primitive and not up to par with Rondo of Blood or even Super Castlevania 4.
So by this point, Konami had established Castlevania as a classic series of challenging horror-inspired action games. But by the mid-1990s, the old-school Castlevania formula was beginning to feel outdated to the gaming public, and with the industry entering its fifth generation of consoles, Castlevania was going to need a real shot in the arm in order to stay relevant. Enter Castlevania Symphony of the Night, released for the original PlayStation on October 2nd, 1997. This game completely revitalized the Castlevania franchise and is often regarded as the best game in the entire series. But the most surprising thing was that it accomplished all of this by drawing inspiration from the black sheep of the series up to that point, Castlevania II: Simon's Quest.
Symphony of the Night brought back and refined a lot of the RPG elements from Simon's Quest and mixed it together with the non-linear exploration of the Metroid series, a mixture now commonly referred to as Metroidvania. But one of the more obvious and interesting changes from Symphony of the Night was the main character. Unlike its predecessors, Symphony's main character was not a whip-wielding vampire hunter, but rather the vampiric son of Dracula himself, Alucard. Originally introduced in Castlevania III Dracula's Curse, Alucard was on a mission to stop the evil reign of his father, but in order to do this, he must first travel throughout the entirety of Dracula's castle, killing enemies, leveling up, and performing magic spells.
Symphony of the Night completely rocked the gaming world upon its release, receiving critical acclaim and near-perfect review scores. In fact, the Symphony of the Night formula was so successful that it completely defined pretty much all 2D Castlevania games that came afterwards. Aside from 2001's Castlevania Chronicles for PS1 and the aforementioned Dracula X Chronicles for PSP, virtually all subsequent 2D Castlevania titles were released for Nintendo handhelds and utilized many aspects of the Symphony of the Night formula. This handheld side series began on the Game Boy Advance with 2001's Castlevania Circle of the Moon and ran all the way to the Nintendo DS in 2008's Castlevania Order of Ecclesia. Every single one of these 6 games received critical acclaim and helped keep the Castlevania brand alive throughout the 2000s.
However, while 2D Castlevania thrived on handhelds, home console entries to the series weren't faring quite as well. A very late adopter of what many other franchises had already mastered, Castlevania attempted to make the jump to 3D with Castlevania 64 and Castlevania Legacy of Darkness. Both of these games were released for the Nintendo 64 in 1999, but due to poor controls, wonky cameras, and disappointing gameplay, they received only mixed to average reviews and are now regarded as 2 of the worst games in the franchise. Konami's next 3D Castlevania attempts, Lament of Innocence and Curse of Darkness, fared a bit better, with Lament of Innocence being released for PlayStation 2 on October 21st, 2003, and Curse of Darkness releasing for PS2 and Xbox on November 1st, 2005.
While nowhere near as infamous as the N64 titles, Lament of Innocence and Curse of Darkness just didn't do enough to convince gamers that Castlevania could work in 3D. And after the lackluster performance of Curse of Darkness and the critical acclaim of Order of Ecclesia, the Castlevania series went on a bit of a hiatus, seeing only spin-off releases for the next 2 years. It would not be until October 5th, 2010 that Konami would put out a new main series Castlevania game in the form of Castlevania Lords of Shadow for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360.
Developed by Mercury Stream and Kojima Productions, Lords of Shadow attempted to modernize the Castlevania franchise by putting inspiration from games such as God of War and Shadow of the Colossus, focusing heavily on combat and quick-time events. While many old-school fans criticized the game for no longer feeling like a true Castlevania experience, Lords of Shadow was still incredibly well received, seeing a PC port in 2013 becoming the best-selling game in the Castlevania series and and once again, helping to revitalize the franchise as a whole. However, unfortunately, the same could not be said for the game's sequels, both of which were developed by Mercury Stream with no involvement from Kojima Productions.
The first sequel, known as Castlevania Lords of Shadow Mirror of Fate, was initially released on March 5th, 2013 as a 3DS exclusive, but later saw an HD re-release for Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 that same year, and then for Steam the following year. Then on February 25th, 2014, Konami and Mercury Steam released Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2 for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3. Both of these sequels garnered decidedly mixed reviews, with Mirror of Fate receiving an average score of 7 out of 10, and Lords of Shadow 2 receiving everything from a 4 to a 7 out of 10. Ugh. Yikes.
So, let's just say that Castlevania's not doing so hot right now. There hasn't been a single Castlevania game announced since the release of Lords of Shadow 2, and considering all of the controversy currently surrounding Konami and their future as a company, who knows what we'll see next and when. However, while the future of Castlevania may be in limbo, there is absolutely no denying the sheer amount of influence this entire franchise has had on the gaming industry and community.
While it never quite reached the heights of franchises like Mario, Zelda, or even something like Final Fantasy, Castlevania is still remembered as an absolutely classic series that helped define an entire new genre of gaming, the previously mentioned Metroidvania style. And while it's not clear whether or not we'll ever see another truly old-school Castlevania game, the Metroidvania formula is thriving in the indie gaming scene. Almost every year, independent developers release game after game greatly influenced by the likes of Super Metroid and Symphony of the Night. In fact, the indie scene has been so supportive of the Metroidvania format that Koji Igarashi, the co-director of Symphony of the Night, took to Kickstarter to fund a new original game heavily inspired by his work on the Castlevania series.
Titled Bloodstained: Ritual of the Night, Igarashi's game aims not only to provide an incredible retro experience, but also to prove to modern game publishers that the community still loves and cares about these old-school games. And as many of us already know, he was right, having raised over 11 times his initial goal on Kickstarter with more than $5.5 million pledged. And I feel like that show of support alone says far more about how influential and beloved the Castlevania series is than we ever could. And with that said, thanks for watching, guys. DFTBA. Don't f the bad apple. Don't f the big ass. There you go. Hey, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you want to see more, go ahead and click that subscribe button to check out some other great videos. And hey, if you want to check out the stuff I'm from, check out our playthrough of Castlevania 4. It's very funny. It's on a channel called Game Grumps. Hope you like it. Anyway, have a wonderful day. Dream of Castlevania tonight.